Not many people go there outside of the Alaskans that live there, but the Arctic region is of vital interest to the United States. Since 1984, the U.S. Arctic Research Commission has been studying the Arctic, coming up with research priorities for the region. Now the Commission's executive director has received a 2019 Presidential Rank Award. Joining me in studio, Dr. John Farrell. Dr. Farrell, good to have you on.
Thanks. Pleasure to be here, Tom.
Let's begin with the commission itself. It's not one of the household names in the pantheon of federal government agencies. Independent Commission, what does it do?
It's primarily designed to inform the President and Congress about what research needs to be done in the Arctic region to inform decisions made by the federal government.
What types of research take place there? I mean, there's climate change, some people believe, changing the ice flow and so forth.
Sure. It's the full range of research, basic and applied research on the environment, on the people that live in the region, on the natural, biological, physical, chemical sciences, all areas, some of it very applied, like infrastructure, buildings, roadways, things like that, to shipping, to research that helps inform national security. It's really the whole thing.
The Arctic has become strategically important. Russia is plying the waters up there with icebreakers. China decided it's an Arctic nation. There's some contention there. But in the research area, do the nations cooperate more?
Yeah, the Arctic is receiving a lot more attention these days, in part because it's warming significantly at twice the rate of the rest of the world. And in terms of being a strategic region, it certainly is. It has been for such a long time, at least through the Cold War, even before that. And I think it's receiving a little bit more attention these days because of the entry of China into the region, which China has declared itself a near-Arctic nation. And it shows interests all over the world, but including the Arctic region.
Getting back to the commission itself, is most of the research done through grants?
Yeah, we're more of a science policy organization. We're not a granting organization. So we work very hard to listen carefully to what the nation and, in fact, the international community says are the priorities for research. And then we put that into a biennial report we release to Congress and the President saying these are the high priority objectives. And then we work with other government agencies that do have significant funds, and they put together a plan to take our objectives and our goals and turn those into actual projects to get the research done.
So I imagine energy must be a big consumer of what the commission puts out.
Sure. The Department of Energy certainly is involved in Arctic research, some of it very basic, such as looking at carbon flows in and out of the region, to very applied things like geothermal energy in Iceland or even supercomputing efforts that they're doing through certain areas.
What about the animals and the wildlife and the flora and fauna up there?
Well, first of all, it's a huge attractor for the tourism industry. A lot of people want to go see things, especially now because of the changes in the environment. So people kind of feel like we really need to get up there to see these things. Some of the animals are having a tough time, honestly, because their environment is changing, particularly those that are dependent on the Arctic sea ice. That's the floating ice upon which they live, like some seals, some polar bears. They hunt from that platform. They rest on the platform. So they're evolving, and it's actually a fascinating thing for the researchers because the ecosystem is really changing quickly. You've got new fish coming into areas that hadn't been there before. So you've got some winners and you have some losers in the ecosystem.
It's interesting because you say it's warming faster than the rest of the world, and yet all of the nations are up there with icebreakers. And the U.S. has at least one icebreaker under construction, and Russia has quite a number of icebreakers operating in there. So apparently there's enough ice to justify lots of icebreakers.
Right. The interesting thing is that while in the summertime the ice does melt back significantly, in the wintertime it still grows back, and it's at least a yard thick, if not more, across the entire northern part of the Arctic Ocean. So winters you'll always see ice, but it's not as thick as it used to be.
We're speaking with Dr. John Farrell. He's executive director of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission and a winner of the Presidential Rank Award this year. And tell us about the commission itself. It sounds like you don't have a really big staff.
No, the commissioners are presidential appointees. By law, there are 8 of them, including the director of the National Science Foundation is an ex officio member. And our chair is Miss Fran Ulmer. And then there are others that are appointed. They are appointed representing the scientific community, 4 of them, 2 from industries, and at least 1 from the Alaskan Native community, so that we make sure we have a good voice from the indigenous peoples in the region.
And so they do the listening with different groups to come up with the research agenda?
Exactly. The commission meets formally 2 to 4 times a year, at least once in Alaska, and we invite many people to come and talk to us and tell us what they think is interesting, scientists, community members, all kinds of people. And we also do stuff internationally to get input on that realm.
And what about Canada? I mean, they have lots of land in the Arctic relative to the United States. Are they involved also?
Very much so. Although the population of Canada is only about that of California,
Sure.
They have a huge expanse and in the Arctic, and they're very interested in that area. And we work closely with our counterparts in Canada, such as Polar Knowledge Canada.
I was just curious, do you get to the Arctic yourself?
I certainly
And
do.
what's it like?
It's an incredible place. It's really something to be seen. And I have had the good fortune of being on icebreakers at sea. I've been up to the North Pole. I've been through many of the Arctic nations, I think all of them, at one point or another. And you really have to see it to appreciate it. It's a stark, beautiful, wonderful place.
Now you have gotten the Presidential Rank Award. What do you think you did to get that?
Well, I don't really know because I don't know what the review panelists saw, but I like to think that they recognize that we are a small agency, but we work very hard and we provide really useful information for the nation. And I'm just very appreciative that my boss put me up for this and that the panel looked favorably upon it.
And you're not a long-term Fed. I mean, you've been in industry a long time.
Well, actually, I've been a Fed for 14 years. Before that, I worked at a university as an associate dean of research. Before that, I worked in nonprofit organizations running science programs.
And what is your scientific specialty?
I'm a geologist by training, a marine geologist, and so I've done a lot of work at sea.
I guess you forget maybe that underneath the Arctic there is ocean, and it's a cold ocean. But I imagine that has a lot of effect on what happens up above.
Well, it's very true. A lot of people who don't know the area very well aren't familiar with the fact that it's an ocean surrounded by continents, whereas Antarctica is a continent surrounded by oceans. There are 8 Arctic nations, and that means nations that actually have land north of the Arctic Circle. But it's a big ocean, and it's becoming much more accessible than it previously was.
And what do you think is the strategic imperative of the United States as more nations ply that area, as China gets involved? What do we need to do?
Well, strategically, it's been important because it's actually the closest pathway between, say, the United States and Russia. And when we had the DEW line during the Cold War, and there's been lots of emphasis on security and defense along that region, it's also a place where shipping is occurring at greater frequency because the ice has been retreating. It's a shorter route from Asia to Europe through the Arctic. It's still very difficult to ship through there because there's a lot of seasonality in the ice. There's not a lot of ports and harbors. And
Yeah, if you get stuck, you're really stuck.
Yeah. I mean, one famous guy said, if you're going to go to the Arctic, you better bring your rescue with you. So strategically, it's important. There's a lot of resources in the Arctic region, natural resources, oil and gas, fish, minerals, and those are receiving a lot of attention too.
Dr. John Farrell is Executive Director of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission and a winner of a Presidential Rank Award this year. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you, Tom. It's a pleasure.
We'll post this interview along with a link to more information at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Hear the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe at Apple Podcasts or Podcast One.